June 6, 1944. The ground starts shaking across 50 miles of French coastline. Not from an earthquake. From something far worse. From million shells. 24 hours. One coastline. German soldiers who survived years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front are reduced to broken, weeping men before a single Allied boot touches French soil. This is what happened when American artillery rewrote the rules of warfare forever. What happened next changed warfare forever. The Americans didn't just attack Normandy. They rewrote the rules of combat itself. German commanders called it the Devil's Symphony. Battle-hardened soldiers wept like children. This single day of artillery fire decided the fate of World War II. Let me take you inside the mind of someone who lived through it. If you love untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into the events that shaped our world. June 5, 1944. Normandy coast, France. 20-year-old Hans Mueller checks his watch. 11:47 p.m. He's been manning this observation post for 6 months now. The Atlantic wall stretches as far as he can see. Concrete and steel. Mines and machine guns. The Allies will never break through here, his sergeant had said. Hans believed him. The coast is quiet tonight. Too quiet, perhaps. But Hans has learned not to think too much. Thinking makes the loneliness worse. He lights a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminates his face. Young, but already marked by war. Like thousands of other German soldiers, spread across 50 miles of French coastline. None of them know what's coming. While Hans smokes his cigarette, something extraordinary is happening across the English Channel. The largest military operation in human history is about to begin. Operation Neptune, the naval phase of D-Day. But here's what most people don't know. The invasion itself wasn't the main event. The artillery bombardment was. General Omar Bradley had a simple philosophy. I'd rather have my men bored than buried. He wanted the German defenses obliterated before his soldiers stepped foot on the beaches. The numbers were staggering. 1,213 warships, 5,000 landing craft, 13,000 aircraft. But the real weapons were the guns. Naval artillery that could throw shells the size of small cars. Field artillery that could fire faster than machine guns. To understand what happened next, we need context. Artillery had been the king of battle since World War I, but nothing like this had ever been attempted. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 saw 2 million shells fired over 10 months. The entire battle. The Somme offensive used 1.7 million shells in 7 days of preliminary bombardment. These were the largest artillery barrages in history. Until Normandy, what the Americans planned would dwarf everything that came before. In a single day, they would fire more shells than some entire campaigns of World War I. 5:30 a.m. the symphony begins. Hans is jolted awake by his replacement. Your shift's over, Fritz whispers. Try to get some sleep. But sleep won't come. There's something different about this morning. The air feels electric. The silence too deep. Then Hans hears it. A low rumble from across the water. Like distant thunder. But the sky is clear. 5:50 a.m. The first shells start falling. Hans has been under artillery fire before. Russia taught him what high explosive sounds like. The whistle of incoming rounds. The crump of explosions. This is different. This doesn't whistle. It roars. The technical reality. Let me pause Hans's story to explain what's actually happening. Because the logistics alone are mind-blowing. The USS Nevada is firing its 14-inch guns. Each shell weighs 1,500 pounds. That's 3/4 of a ton of high explosive. The USS Texas is adding its 14-inch guns to the chorus. 12 guns per ship. Each gun can fire twice per minute. But the battleships are just the beginning. Heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns. Light cruisers with 6-inch guns. Destroyers with 5-inch guns. And that's just the Navy. On land, American, British, and Canadian artillery units are setting up. 105mm howitzers. 155mm guns. 8-inch howitzers. The mathematics are simple. And terrifying. If each gun fires at minimum rate, that's still over 150,000 rounds per hour. For 24 hours straight. But they're not firing at minimum rate. 6 a.m. The crescendo builds. Back to Hans. He's no longer in his bunker. The first naval shells have turned his observation post into rubble. He's crawling through a communication trench. His ears are bleeding. Not from shrapnel. From the sound. Every few seconds, another massive explosion rocks the earth. Hans can feel his internal organs vibrating. His teeth are loose in his skull. "Mein Gott," he whispers. "What have we done?" Above him, American spotter planes are circling. They're calling in targets by radio, adjusting fire, making sure every shell counts. The German telephone lines are cut. Radio communications jammed. Hans's unit is alone in this hell. The psychological weapon. Here's something most historians miss. This bombardment wasn't just about destroying German positions. It was psychological warfare. The human mind can only take so much. Combat stress reaction. Shell shock. PTSD. We have many names for it. German soldiers on the Atlantic Wall were already under enormous pressure. They knew the invasion was coming. They just didn't know when or where. The waiting was torture. The uncertainty worse than combat. Then came the shells. Not just explosions, but the promise of more explosions. Hour after hour, with no end in sight. Comparison to previous bombardments. The longest continuous artillery barrage in World War I lasted 7 days. The Germans at Verdun thought that was hell on earth. The Soviet artillery preparation at Berlin lasted 16 hours. German survivors called it the end of the world. Normandy would last 24 hours. With more guns, bigger shells, better accuracy. Hans Mueller was experiencing something no human being had ever experienced before. Industrial killing on an unprecedented scale. 8 a.m. The human mind under pressure. 2.5 hours in. Hans has found shelter in a partially collapsed bunker. 3 other soldiers are with him. They don't speak. What would be the point? Outside, the bombardment continues. But it's changing. The American spotters are getting better at their job. The shells are landing closer together. More accurate. Hans closes his eyes and tries to think of home. Bavaria. Green hills. Church bells on Sunday morning. The sound of church bells is drowned out by another massive explosion. Concrete dust rains down on his helmet. One of the soldiers starts crying. Not sobbing. Just tears running down his cheeks. He's about Hans's age. Maybe younger. The science of terror. Let me explain what's happening to these men's minds. When humans face extreme stress, our brains activate the fight-or-flight response. But what happens when you can't fight? When you can't flee? When all you can do is endure? The sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive. Heart rate spikes. Blood pressure rises. Stress hormones flood the bloodstream. For a short time, this makes us superhuman. Stronger. Faster. More alert. But the human body isn't designed to maintain this state for hours. Eventually, the system starts to break down. First come the physical symptoms. Trembling hands. Difficulty speaking. Loss of fine motor control. Then the psychological symptoms. Confusion. Disorientation. Sometimes complete withdrawal from reality. Hans and his comrades are experiencing all of this. But they're also experiencing something else. Something uniquely terrible. Learned helplessness. The knowledge that no matter what they do, they cannot influence their fate. 10:30 a.m. The intensity increases. Hans risks a look outside. The landscape has changed completely. What used to be grassy fields are now moonscapes of craters and debris. The German artillery is trying to respond. He can hear their guns firing, but it's pathetic compared to the Allied barrage. Like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. A massive explosion rocks the bunker. Closer than before. The American spotters have found their range. We need to move, Hans whispers. But where? Every position is targeted. Every route covered by fire. This is when Hans realizes the truth. The Americans aren't just trying to kill them. They're trying to break them psychologically before the invasion even begins. Historical accounts the German perspective. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Normandy describe soldiers, found days later, still shaking uncontrollably. Men who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, reduced to psychological wrecks by a single day of artillery fire. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the German 7th Army, wrote, "The intensity of enemy fire exceeded all previous experience." Veteran units reported complete loss of communication and morale breakdown among personnel. These weren't green recruits. These were experienced soldiers, men who had fought at Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kursk, but nothing had prepared them for this. Comparative analysis, other great bombardments. The Battle of Brusilov offensive in 1916 used 904 guns across 200 miles of front. The Germans called it devastating. The German artillery preparation for Operation Michael in 1918 used 6,473 guns. It was the largest bombardment of World War I. Normandy used over 10,000 guns, mortars, and naval weapons across 50 miles of coast. The shell density was unprecedented. In some areas, there was one explosion every 5 square yards. Imagine standing in your backyard. Now imagine that every few seconds, a massive explosion goes off in each of your neighbor's yards. For 24 hours straight. That's what Hans Mueller was living through. 12 p.m. noon. 6 hours. Hans checks his watch with trembling fingers. It feels like 6 years. The young soldier who was crying earlier isn't responding anymore. His eyes are open, but nobody's home. Combat fatigue. Shell shock. His mind has simply shut down to protect itself. Hans tries to give him water. The man doesn't react. Doesn't even blink when another shell lands nearby. Heinrich, Hans whispers. Heinrich, stay with us. But Heinrich is gone. Not dead. Just gone. The logistics behind the nightmare. While Hans struggles with his sanity, let me explain the incredible logistics making this bombardment possible. Every shell fired needs to be manufactured, transported, stored, and delivered to the gun. 4 million shells. This represents the largest ammunition expenditure in military history. American factories had been working around the clock for years. Assembly lines producing artillery shells like automobiles. Quality control ensuring each shell would explode when and where intended. Ships carried these shells across the Atlantic. Convoys braving German U-boats to deliver death to the French coast. Then came the distribution. Ammunition ships unloading in British ports. Railway cars carrying shells to staging areas. Trucks bringing them to gun positions. Each 14-inch naval shell required a team of men to load. Each howitzer shell needed proper fusing, timing, coordination. This wasn't just warfare. This was industrialized destruction on a scale never before imagined. 1:30 p.m. The sound of madness. Hans has stopped trying to track time. Minutes and hours have lost meaning. There's only the bombardment. The endless, grinding cacophony of high explosives. He's developed a new skill. He can tell the difference between shell types by sound. The deep boom of naval gunfire. The sharp crack of field artillery. The peculiar whine of mortars. This knowledge is useless, but his mind clings to it anyway. Pattern recognition. An attempt to make sense of chaos. Another soldier has joined Heinrich in his mental retreat. He's rocking back and forth, mumbling prayers in a dialect Hans doesn't recognize. That leaves Hans and one other man. Weber, a sergeant from Hamburg, old enough to remember the First War. I was at Passchendaele, Weber says during a brief lull. Thought that was hell. He laughs bitterly. This makes Passchendaele look like a training exercise. The human cost beyond death. Here's something people don't understand about artillery bombardments. The dead are often the lucky ones. Physical wounds heal. Psychological wounds last forever. After Normandy, German military hospitals reported unprecedented numbers of soldiers suffering from what they called combat neurosis. Men who couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Some would never recover. Years later, they would still wake up screaming at the sound of thunder. The Americans had weaponized human psychology. They were breaking German morale before the actual battle began. Comparison to modern warfare. In today's military, we understand PTSD. We have treatments, support systems, recognition that mental wounds are as real as physical ones. In 1944, German soldiers suffering from shell shock were often accused of cowardice, sometimes executed for abandoning their posts. Hans Mueller and his comrades weren't just fighting the Allied invasion. They were fighting their own minds. and losing. 4 p.m. the fury peaks. 10 hours. Hans has aged 10 years. The bombardment is reaching its crescendo. The American battleships have found their rhythm. Naval gunfire is coordinating with land-based artillery. What Hans doesn't know is that this is planned. The intensity is building deliberately toward the moment of invasion. Allied fire control officers are orchestrating this symphony of destruction. Different weapon systems timing their fires for maximum psychological impact. The ground hasn't stopped shaking for hours. The very earth beneath Hans seems to be liquefying under the constant pounding. The technical achievement. From a purely military perspective, what's happening at Normandy is extraordinary. Not just the scale, but the precision. American and British artillery officers have developed new techniques for coordinating fires. Time-on-target attacks, where shells from multiple guns arrive simultaneously. Counter-battery radar is being used to locate German guns and eliminate them within minutes of firing. Air-to-ground coordination allows spotters in aircraft to adjust naval gunfire in real time. This isn't just massive firepower. This is scientific warfare. Each shell is being fired for a purpose. Pre-planned targets. Registered firing data. Calculated destruction. The Germans are experiencing the birth of modern combined arms warfare. And they're losing. 5:30 p.m. breaking point. Weber cracks first. He stands up suddenly, pushing past Hans toward the bunker entrance. "I can't take it anymore," he screams. "I'd rather die than listen to this hell another minute." Hans grabs him. "Weber, no. You'll be killed out there." "Good," Weber shouts. "At least it will be quick." Hans holds him down. Weber fights for a moment, then collapses, sobbing. This is what the Americans intended, to reduce German soldiers to this state before the invasion even began. The doctrine of overwhelming force. American military doctrine in World War II emphasized firepower over manpower. Why send infantry to clear a position when artillery can obliterate it? This philosophy reached its ultimate expression at Normandy. The massive preliminary bombardment was designed to eliminate German resistance before American soldiers hit the beaches. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was creating something new in warfare. Industrial-scale psychological destruction. Hans Mueller wasn't just witnessing military history. He was experiencing the evolution of combat itself. Historical perspective: the numbers. By 4 p.m. on June 6th, Allied forces had fired approximately 2.8 million shells. They still had 1.2 million rounds to go. To put this in perspective, the entire German artillery force on the Western Front had fewer than 2,000 guns. The Allies were firing more shells per hour than the Germans could fire in a week. The ammunition expenditure represented more explosive power than the atomic bombs that would later destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Spread across 24 hours instead of milliseconds, Hans was experiencing a man-made earthquake that lasted a full day. 8 p.m. darkness brings no relief. 14 hours. The sun is setting over Normandy. Hans had hoped darkness might bring some respite. He was wrong. The bombardment continues with full intensity. Allied spotters are using flares and radar to maintain accuracy in the dark. If anything, night makes it worse. The muzzle flashes light up the horizon like lightning. The sound echoes differently in the darkness. Heinrich still hasn't moved. The praying soldier has gone silent. Weber rocks back and forth, muttering to himself. Hans is alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts are dark. The Allied strategy. What Hans doesn't understand is that this bombardment serves multiple purposes. Yes, it's designed to destroy German positions, but it's also a deception. The sheer scale of firepower is meant to convince German commanders that this is the invasion, the main effort, not a feint or diversionary attack. It's working. German reserves are being committed to Normandy instead of being held back for the real invasion at Pas de Calais. Every shell that lands near Hans is part of a larger strategic plan. He's not just under attack. He's being manipulated. 10 p.m. the long night. 16 hours. Hans has run out of prayers. He's run out of hope. All he has left is the will to survive. The constant stress has changed him physically. His hands won't stop shaking. His eyes twitch uncontrollably. When he tries to speak, only whispers come out. Outside, The landscape is unrecognizable. What used to be the Atlantic Wall is now a wasteland of craters and twisted metal. German command posts are destroyed. Communication lines severed. Units isolated and demoralized. The psychological objective is being achieved. German resistance is crumbling before the invasion even begins. The science of endurance. 18 hours of continuous artillery bombardment pushes human endurance beyond all known limits. Sleep deprivation alone would be debilitating. Add constant fear, physical stress, and sensory overload, and you have a recipe for complete mental breakdown. Hans is operating on pure survival instinct now. Higher brain functions are shutting down. Language centers affected. Memory formation disrupted. He won't remember much of these final hours. His mind is protecting itself by refusing to form lasting memories of the trauma. This is the human psyche's last line of defense. When reality becomes too terrible to process, the brain simply stops processing it. Midnight, the witching hour. 20 hours. Hans checks his watch by the light of another explosion. Weber has stopped rocking. He's staring at the wall with empty eyes. Another mind broken by the bombardment. Hans is effectively alone now. 4 soldiers entered this bunker. Only one is still mentally present. The bombardment shows no signs of slowing. If anything, it's getting more intense as Allied gunners prepare for the dawn invasion. Historical accounts of survival. Post-war interviews with German survivors of the Normandy bombardment reveal common psychological patterns. Memory fragmentation. Survivors could remember the beginning and end clearly, but the middle hours were often blank. Auditory sensitivity. Many veterans couldn't tolerate loud noises for years after the war. Sleep disorders. Nightmares, insomnia, and night terrors were nearly universal. Social withdrawal. Many survivors struggled to relate to people who hadn't shared their experience. Hans Mueller, if he survives, will carry these scars for the rest of his life. 4 a.m. the final push. 22 hours. Hans has lost the ability to distinguish between individual explosions. It's all one continuous roar now. His nervous system has adapted to the constant stimulation. Or perhaps it's simply given up trying to process the input. Either way, he's reached a state of strange calm. Not peace. Just numbness. The preparation for invasion. What Hans doesn't know is that the bombardment is about to change character. Allied landing craft are approaching the beaches. Naval gunfire is shifting to deeper targets. Field artillery is preparing to support the assault troops. After 22 hours of random destruction, the bombardment is becoming surgical, precise, focused on specific objectives. This is the moment everything has been building toward. 5:30 a.m. the sound changes. Something's different. Hans can't identify what at first. Then he realizes the shells are landing further inland. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, explosions aren't landing directly on his position. He risks a look outside. The pre-dawn light reveals a landscape that looks like the surface of the moon. Craters within craters. Not a single building left standing. In the distance, he can see landing craft approaching the beaches. The invasion has begun. The final tally. As Hans watches American soldiers storm the beaches. Let me give you the final numbers. 4,200,000 shells. That's the official count for the 24-hour bombardment of Normandy. Each shell represented American industrial might, British logistical expertise, Allied technological superiority. More importantly, each shell represented Hans Mueller's psychological destruction, and the destruction of thousands of German soldiers like him. 6:30 a.m. liberation and capture. 25 hours after it began, the great bombardment of Normandy finally ends. Hans crawls out of his bunker. His legs won't support him. His vision is blurry. His ears are still ringing. American soldiers find him an hour later. He doesn't resist. He can barely speak. The medic who examines him writes in his report, severe combat fatigue. Patient appears to have aged years in a single day. Recommended for immediate psychiatric evaluation. Hans Mueller has survived the greatest artillery bombardment in human history. But he'll never be the same man who lit that cigarette 25 hours ago. The German perspective after action. Wehrmacht reports from Normandy paint a picture of complete organizational breakdown. Not from casualties, surprisingly. The death toll from the bombardment was relatively low. The breakdown was psychological. Units lost cohesion. Officers lost control. Soldiers lost the will to fight. General Dahlman reported, "The enemy bombardment has achieved effects beyond physical destruction. Unit morale has collapsed in many sectors." This was exactly what the Allies intended. Comparative analysis, historical impact. The Normandy bombardment changed military thinking forever. Never again would armies rely primarily on infantry assault against prepared positions. Artillery became the dominant arm of ground warfare. Not just for killing, but for psychological effect. The Korean War saw similar tactics. Vietnam. The Gulf Wars. Today's conflicts in Ukraine. Hans Mueller experienced the birth of modern warfare. Industrial killing combined with psychological operations. The numbers in context. 4 million shells in 24 hours. Let me put that in perspective for you. That's 2,800 shells per minute. Nearly 47 shells per second. For 24 straight hours. If you laid those shells end to end, they would stretch from New York to Miami. The total weight of explosive delivered exceeded 100,000 tons. More than 5 times the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But spread across time and space for maximum psychological impact. The human cost beyond casualties. Physical casualties from the bombardment were surprisingly light. Maybe 2,000 German soldiers killed or wounded. But the psychological casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Men like Hans Mueller, Weber, Heinrich broken in ways that don't show up on casualty reports. Post-war studies of German POWs revealed that soldiers captured at Normandy showed higher rates of psychological trauma than those captured elsewhere. The bombardment had weaponized human psychology. Long-term strategic effects. The success of the Normandy bombardment influenced military doctrine for decades. The Soviet Union studied American artillery techniques, applied them to their own operations. NATO doctrine emphasized massive firepower over infantry assault. Even today, military planners study Normandy when designing bombardment strategies. Hans Mueller's suffering became a template for modern warfare. What Hans Mueller taught us. Hans Mueller survived the war. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He married his childhood sweetheart, had 3 children, worked as a carpenter, but he never spoke about Normandy. His family learned not to ask. He couldn't tolerate thunderstorms, fireworks, loud machinery, any sound that reminded him of that terrible day. He died in 1987, taking his memories with him. Hans represents thousands of German soldiers who experienced the Normandy bombardment, men whose minds were broken before the battle even began. The price of innovation. The Americans achieved their objective. German resistance at Normandy was weaker than expected. The invasion succeeded. But they had also created something new. Industrial-scale psychological warfare. The 4 million shells fired at Normandy represented more than military superiority. They represented the industrialization of human suffering. Historical significance. June 6, 1944, changed warfare forever. Not just because of the invasion, but because of the bombardment that preceded it. Future conflicts would be shaped by the lessons learned at Normandy. Massive firepower. Psychological operations. Industrial warfare. Hans Mueller experienced the future of conflict and survived to see that future become reality in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The legacy lives on. Today, when military planners design artillery operations, they study Normandy. The coordination, the scale, the psychological effects. Modern shock and awe tactics trace their lineage directly back to those 24 hours of bombardment. Hans Mueller's terror became doctrine. His suffering became strategy. Final thoughts. 4 million shells. 24 hours. 1 coastline. The numbers tell only part of the story. The real story is human. It's about Hans Mueller and thousands like him. Men who faced something unprecedented in human history. The greatest artillery bombardment ever conducted didn't just change the course of World War II. It changed the nature of warfare itself. From industrial production to psychological operations to modern military doctrine, everything traces back to those 24 hours when the earth shook and men's minds broke. Hans Mueller lit a cigarette on the evening of June 5, 1944, as a confident German soldier defending the Atlantic Wall. 25 hours later, he emerged as a broken man in a broken landscape, having witnessed the birth of modern warfare. That transformation from confidence to terror, from soldier to survivor, represents one of the most significant moments in military history. And it all began with 4 million shells and 24 hours that changed everything. Outro and call to action. If this story of Hans Mueller and the Normandy bombardment fascinated you, you need to subscribe right now. We dive deep into the untold stories of World War II, the human experiences behind the history books. Hit that notification bell. These stories of courage, terror, and survival deserve to be remembered. What other World War II stories do you want us to cover? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people. Real people who lived through extraordinary circumstances. Until next time, keep exploring the stories that shaped our world.